Okay, in this video we're going to talk about cell communication, how cells communicate to each other. So cell communication can be local signaling, or it can be long distance signaling. So examples of local signaling will be, say this is a mast cell and it's up in your sinuses and you've just been exposed to an allergen. It's going to release histamine. Histamine is a signal that causes other cells around it to respond by producing mucus or producing tears and things. So this is an example of a local signal in a mast cell releasing histamine. Nerve cells also release signals locally. So nerves produce these things called neurotransmitters. When they fire an action potential, that results in neurotransmitters binding to a nearby neuron, which then causes a nerve signal to go through that nerve. So this is another example of a local signal. The endocrine system is involved in long-term signaling. So we have endocrine cells, like in your adrenal glands, producing adrenaline, which goes into your blood vessels, and that targets target cells, your heart, your lungs, increasing their heart and breathing rates, or your digestive system, which shuts down and slows down its processes. So these are long distance signals. They're produced in cells in some glands, in some part of the body, and they have target cells very, very far away. But in either way, cells have to be able to produce chemical signals that then are acted upon and cause a response in other cells in other parts of the body. Okay, so let's look at two ways that can occur. One of them is through these gap junctions, where we can have in animal cells basically pores within the membrane whereby chemical signals or hormones can pass from cell to cell. Plant cells have these things called plasmodesmata, which are basically holes within the cell wall or channels within the cell wall that allow, again, chemical signals or hormones to move between cells to respond maybe by producing more chloroplasts when there's more sunlight or something such as that. We also have external communications where we have, this is a white blood cell and it is presenting an antigen to a T cell here, a helper T cell, which is then going to receive that antigen signal and cause a response, an immune response. So this is another cell-to-cell signal. In this case, it's external communication between two cells, again presenting an antigen, a protein, to a different cell, causing a response. Okay, so two ways that long-distance signaling can occur. The first one is if we have a hormone and it's a protein-based hormone, it's going to bind to a protein receptor on the membrane. Proteins can't pass through the membrane here, so it's going to bind to this protein receptor. That protein is going to change in a way, and it's going to be able to change in a way that it activates another protein, which then activates another protein, which activates another protein. This process of one protein activating another protein, this kind of domino effect, is called signal transduction until we finally get to this protein involved in the response. So maybe this is a protein that's going to start to, turn on a transcription factor to copy some genes or something, or start to synthesize a desired protein within this cell. Okay, so that's the way a protein hormone works. If we have a steroid protein, remember steroids are lipids. Lipids can pass through this phospholipid bilayer, okay? They like that, and they can pass through that very easily. They can also pass through the nuclear membrane, again, the lipid bilayer there. So a hormone can pass through the cell membrane, through the nuclear membrane, and bind directly to a receptor within the nucleus. And this receptor might be something called a transcription factor, something that's required for transcription or copying of the DNA into RNA to occur. So this could activate that transcription factor and start this transcription process whereby DNA is copied into mRNA, and that RNA goes out to the ribosome and results in a protein synthesis. So again, steroids, because they're lipids, act very differently than do proteins because of their permeability of the cell membrane. So again, looking at this protein hormones and how they work, there's again the three steps. We have reception, a protein receptor on the membrane receives it. It initiates a transduction process where it causes a change and activation of a protein, which activates another protein, which activates another protein. That's called transduction, moving again into the cell, a process of one activating another until we finally get to the response. A protein is activated that will produce the desired response. So that's again how protein hormones work in signal transduction. In other cases, these proteins might actually involve binding and opening up a channel protein. So example, in neurons, remember in neurons we have an action potential is generated by this rushing in of sodium ions. So what happens there? Well, we have a neurotransmitter up here, binds to this channel protein. When it binds to it, it activates it and causes it to open, just like we did in that simulation. When it opens, all that sodium is going to move into the neuron, causing a increase in the internal charge of that neuron. And that's going to cause this action potential, this neuron to become charged and send this electrical signal down the neuron in what we call an action potential. So in this case, the signal is actually activating a channel protein to cause a response within the cell. Again, steroids work, again, not by binding to a surface protein, but by passing through the membrane, binding to a protein within either the plasma, or the cytoplasm, or the nucleus, and then initiating directly that transcription. So they can bypass this transduction process and basically go to the protein that's desired, because they can pass all the way into the cell as far as needed and cause that direct response. In this case, transcription factor causes transcription of a gene which produces mRNA, which then is translated into a protein in that process of protein synthesis. So again, these protein hormones initiate this process, and sometimes it's called a phosphorylation cascade. So you can think of a cascade as kind of water going sort of over a waterfall in sort of little bits and pieces, kind of like a big waterfall broken up into many small waterfalls. I don't know if that makes sense to you. It's what I think of when I think of cascade. But what's happening here is the signal is, again, activating a receptor. That receptor then activates a relay molecule, which causes the phosphorylation of a protein, what's called protein kinase. These are proteins that activate other proteins. So when that protein gets activated, it's going to activate a second protein. And the way it activates it is it phosphorylates it. That means that protein kinase sticks one of the phosphates from an ATP onto that phosphorylated protein. And when it's phosphorylated, that protein has become activated. So we're using that molecule ATP, the energy molecule, to activate and turn on these proteins. So we are phosphorylating inactive proteins into active proteins. So we have the first one activating the second one activating the third one, until we finally get to this inactive protein, which is going to become activated, and it's going to cause that cell response, synthesizing proteins or enzymes or whatever is required within that cell. So this is, again, a phosphorylation cascade. These proteins are activating other proteins in this cascading response, one after another after another. Another example of that would be this molecule CAMP, which again can be activated by a messenger binding to a receptor, which activates something called a G protein or GTP, again phosphorylating adenyl cyclase, which then produces CAMP, the secondary messenger, which then activates the protein kinase. This is what happens in liver cells in response to adrenaline or epinephrine. So when adrenaline gets to your liver, it causes the metabolism of glycogen into glucose, and it's this process of the adrenaline binding to a receptor, initiating this, again, protein phosphorylation cascade, ultimately producing enzymes which will convert glycogen, the polysaccharide, into glucose, so that glucose can get into your blood for your heart and your muscles in that fight or flight response, which is what happens when you're excited and you're producing adrenaline. And another example of that, again, is growth factor, which again causes cells to divide and causes, again, not only growth, getting bigger, but again, cell division. So growth factor will bind to a receptor, activate one inactive protein into an active protein. Again, these protein kinase reactions, this sort of phosphorylation cascade, activates another protein, which activates another protein. Then when we finally get into the nucleus, we activate an inactive transcription factor, which is then going to go unzip a specific gene and allow for the transcription of a specific gene. genes probably associated with cell division and growth in this case. So another good example of a phosphorylation cascade involved in a response within, in this case, growth factor causing cell division. So these are some ways that cells communicate with other cells, both locally and long distance within the body.